In this session, we're going to take a look at the how. How do we apply these biblical principles in our youth ministry setting? You know, I meet a lot of youth workers who say things like, well, our youth ministry is not growing. And part of the reason is they're not expressing the biblical purpose of evangelism. Or others might say, you know, our students are apathetic, lazy. Well, probably they're not expressing the biblical purpose of ministry. Other youth workers say things like, our kids just don't have any passion. Well, maybe they're not expressing the biblical purpose of worship. Others might say, you know, when my students graduate from our ministry, they graduate from their faith. Well, that's because maybe there isn't a strong emphasis on discipleship. Other problems I've heard people say, you know, we've got so many cliques. And maybe the reason behind that is there isn't true biblical fellowship that's being taught. Because biblical fellowship, cliques wouldn't happen. So with each of the issues and the problems that we have in a youth ministry setting, there can usually be an answer that one of the biblical purposes isn't being fulfilled. Now, I would guess that in your youth ministry setting, you're probably doing a good job on most of the biblical purposes. And what we're going to do in this session is take a look at what are some things that might be transferable to your setting in your church, regardless of if you're in the city or if you're in a suburban area, if you're rural. It doesn't really matter what your denomination is. We're going to take a look at 5 biblical purposes, and I want to give you 3 ideas, 3 action steps under each one that can drop into your context no matter where you are, okay? Let's start with the purpose of evangelism. Let me give you 3 things that you might think about, you might consider as transferable to your setting. The first is this. I want to encourage you to appreciate the fear that evangelism brings to most students. Let's face it, evangelism is scary. Sharing our faith, telling other people what we believe. Sometimes we don't even know what we believe, we just know we do believe. And when you appreciate their fear, and when you acknowledge it, they open themselves up to, you really understand what I'm going through. I mean, when I tell a student, hey, I want you to invite somebody to church or share your faith, their eyes get big and you can see it on their face. But when you appreciate that, it just moves you that much closer to them warming up to the whole idea of evangelism. The second action is I want to encourage you to recognize that evangelism is a continual process rather than a one-time program. I think in youth ministry, we've made this mistake to think that we have evangelistic programs. And there is an edge to our programs that can be evangelistic, but God doesn't necessarily just work in our one-hour program. Evangelism is a process. It's a matter of sowing seeds and getting the word out there and knowing that it doesn't have to take place in our little conditions within our time clock. So recognize that evangelism is a process. The third action is to challenge your students with realistic baby steps. A lot of times when it comes to evangelism, we want students to memorize these 5 steps and go out and accost strangers. What I'm suggesting with baby steps is maybe you start, because we already know they're afraid, is start with little things like tell your friends you go to church. Maybe something simple like invite them to an appropriate program. How about defining and articulating your testimony? Walk them through some baby steps to warm them up to the whole idea that evangelism is God's command, that we are called to be His witnesses. The second biblical purpose that I want to take a look at is fellowship. Now, a lot of us in youth ministry have abused this term. We've said everything is fellowship. Hey, come on to youth group, it'll be a great time of fellowship. Hey, there's pizza back there, let's go back, eat, and have fellowship. Frisbee, it'll be a wonderful sporting event of fellowship. Folks, fellowship is the biblical act of caring for one another and loving on one another and being connected. So what can we do that's transferable to your setting? Here's 3 things. The first is, begin with the care question. Ask yourself, how do we care for the students that God has entrusted to us? Do we know if a student is missing? I mean, if we're saying that fellowship is caring and body and family, if one of my kids gets lost in my personal family, I'm going to go out and look for them. If they don't come home at night, I'm going to track them down. That's care. Begin with the care question. The second action step that's transferable as we talk about fellowship is this, that we would pursue a strategy that includes life on life. I mean, somewhere in youth ministry, an adult life ought to interact with a student life. I mean, that's why we have youth ministry, is that we put life on life. There's something that can't be described. There's something supernatural. There's something divine that God uses men and women who care for students. Include a strategy that includes life on life. If you were to read 1 Thessalonians 2, Paul says this, "We loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well, because you had become so dear to us." How do you become dear to somebody? You share your life with them. And as we talk about biblical fellowship is life on life. Whatever your strategy looks like, whether it's weekly small groups or monthly small groups, quarterly small groups, I don't care. What I do care about, that it involves life on life. The third action step for fellowship that's transferable to your setting is this: to set a high goal for your care plan to reflect the biblical one another's. Now, it is a high goal. And to have your youth ministry fellowship be the biblical one another's is not going to be reached overnight. It's going to take some time. But as you think about the biblical one another's, to love one another, serve one another, accept one another, forgive one another, greet one another, bear one another's burdens, be devoted to one another, honor one another, teach one another, submit to one another, and encourage one another. That's biblical fellowship. And it is a high goal and it will take time, but if we don't set that goal, we'll never reach it. Fellowship. The third biblical purpose that I want to talk about is discipleship, helping believers grow in Christ. Really, that's why we do what we do. When Jesus gave us this great commission, teaching them to obey all things. That's what discipleship is. So let me give you 3 things to think about, 3 action steps. Number 1 is this: communicate the goal of discipleship as transformation, not program attendance. For many of us in youth ministry, we spend way too much time and energy on program numbers, how many you're running, and we put our value based on whether our Sunday school attendance is up or how our numbers are doing, or other people want to know about our numbers. Forget that. That's not youth ministry. What discipleship is transformation. We want lives changed. We want students to grow on their own. I would much rather have a student not attend one of my programs if I knew he or she was growing in their faith on their own and developing habits that are going to last them a lifetime, rather than fill in a chair. Discipleship isn't about attendance, it's about transformation. The second transferable principle is this: introduce students to habits that will help them grow spiritually on their own. Now, I've mentioned this a few times in this video series, and it's written throughout all my book, Purpose-Driven Youth Ministry, but that's what discipleship is. It's helping students grow on their own. And if we can give them habits, we've heard the old expression, don't just hand people a fish, teach them how to fish. That's great when it comes to youth ministry. Just don't give kids facts and memorize this map and open up your cranium and let me cram in a bunch of information. Teach them to think. Teach them to pray on their own, to read the Word on their own. That's what discipleship is. It's preparing students with habits, so when they graduate from our youth ministry, they won't graduate from their faith. When I think about students growing on their own, I think of that passage in Philippians 2, verse 12, where Paul says this: "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling." When I think about discipleship, I think about students growing on their own in our absence, in the absence of program and in the absence of people. The third action step I want to challenge you towards is to pursue balance in your discipleship efforts. For so many of us, our discipleship is 100% teaching. Can I encourage you to look for more balance than just teaching? That discipleship is teaching, discipleship is modeling from leaders, and discipleship is preparing students with tools and resources so they can grow on their own. As I think about balance, I do think about teaching and education. I do think about modeling, leaders modeling to students how to grow, how to pray, how to read the Bible, and then also giving them tools and resources so they can grow on their own. That's balance. Pursue that and you'll have healthy discipleship. When it comes to the biblical purpose of ministry, meeting needs with love. Some people refer to this as missions. They say, is missions and ministry the same thing? Sure. Are you meeting needs with love? That's ministry. And as we talk about ministry, let me say three things. Number one is this: provide ministry opportunities for all students. That all of the students in your ministry, regardless of where their spiritual commitment is, can do some form of service. For example, you might have some crowd students that are just, their spiritual commitment is hearing about Christ. Maybe they can serve by stacking chairs after a program or an event. But your core students, those that are more committed to Christ, they might be stacking chairs in a third world country as they're helping out in Haiti or something like that. The idea is that all of your students can do some form of ministry or service opportunity. They don't all have to be intense. Some might be light, entry level, and that's okay. But if you provide opportunities for all of them, you give them a taste of what ministry is all about. The second thing you can do is to make your youth ministry or your church's needs your serving opportunities. You see, in a church, we have a lot of opportunities to serve. Offering needs to be taken, the parking lot needs to be swept, the windows need to be washed. In your youth ministry, maybe a drama needs to be written, some music needs to be led. During your teaching time, maybe you've got somebody that's using PowerPoint. Well, I've got kids in my ministry who are computer nerds, and they can put PowerPoint stuff together. Whatever need you have, just turn it into a ministry. So instead of saying, well, I can't think of anything for our students to do, just look around your church. What are the needs you have? Make a list of all those needs. All of a sudden, those become ministry opportunities. The third thing you might be able to do is to challenge everyone to discover their unique shape for ministry. That discovery is an important part of ownership with ministry. That I want people to spend some time discovering how God has gifted them or how God has uniquely shaped them. Now, as you look in your notebook, you can see that SHAPE stands for 5 things. It stands for spiritual gifts, that's the S. The H is heart, what do they love to do? The A is abilities, what natural talents and skills do they have? Did they have maybe before they became a Christian that they can use now? The P is personality, how are they wired? What unique contribution does their personality make? And the E is experience. Where have they been? Where have they been before Christ? What is their testimony? And as you ask students those questions and you sit down with them knee to knee and you look them eye to eye and you say, okay, where do you think God has gifted you? What are your spiritual gifts? And maybe you give them a little spiritual gifts test for them to discover it. A lot of students don't even know what their giftedness is. And then you ask them, what do you love to do? And you write that down. What are your abilities? What natural skills do you have? And you write that down. What about your personality? How's that unique? And then your experience, where have you been? How did you come to Christ? What about some hurts in your life? And ask them about their pains and their hurts. And you know why you might ask them that? Because God will not waste a hurt. And then you gather all that information together. And you say, if you could do one thing for God and you knew you wouldn't fail, what would it be? You see, I love to look at students and say, congratulations, you are gifted. God has gifted students. God has gifted any believer with a spiritual gift, with a heart, with abilities, personality, and experience. And if you and I take a little bit of time, and it does take time, to look at students and say, how has God shaped you for ministry? You can help them discover what God wants them to do and who God wants them to be. With the biblical purpose of worship, this is the most difficult one for us to get our arms around. Worship could be defined as expressing our love to God. Let me give you 3 things to think about. The first is this: help students see worship as bigger than singing. See, a lot of us, we've taken singing, we say, well, when we sing, that's when we're worshiping God. Well, worship is much bigger than that. The Bible tells us that worship is seen through prayer, When we hear the Word being taught, worship is seen through giving, baptizing, meditating, the Lord's Supper. It's a lot bigger than singing. Worship is much bigger than singing. And help students see that, because when they see that, it opens their eyes to the different ways that they can worship God, which leads us to number 2. Teach worship as a celebration of God's presence that is reflected in our lifestyle. You see, we worship God with our life. The Bible tells us in Romans 12:1, "And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind He will accept. When you think of what He has done for you, is this too much to ask?" Another translation says, "Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, which is your spiritual act of worship." That worship is our life. It's our response to God. And number 3 is this: realize that non-Christians can be ministered to by authentic Christian worship. Now, can non-Christians worship? No, but they can be ministered to by authentic worship. When somebody's in a room and people are praising the Lord and the Word is being taught and the Lord's Supper is being shared, that non-Christians look around, they see what's going on, and oftentimes they're, whoa. I mean, if you look in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 2, you see that God's power took over. And as people walked up, some people were turned off by what was happening, but other people stood in awe to see that people were worshiping God in a very real and genuine way. You see, a youth ministry that expresses worship, it's seen in students' lifestyle. It's seen when people understand that it's a lot bigger than worship. I love what it says in Psalm 122, and David said, "I was glad when I went to the house of the Lord." He didn't say I was mad. He didn't say I was sad. He said, "I was glad when I went to the house of the Lord." Worship the Lord with gladness. You see, a right heart and a right response before God, when we understand it, all we can do is worship Him. Much bigger than singing. It's our lifestyle. And when we embrace worship as our lifestyle, it can minister to those outside of the church. Now, as you look back over all those things you just wrote down, 5 purposes and 3 ideas under each one, that's a lot of material. It's a lot to think about. What I want to encourage you to do now is to go into a time of just reflection. In your notebook, I want you to write down just some responses that you have, maybe some things you disagree with, some things you agree with. Don't get so caught up in how it's going to work into a specific program, but when you think of the word worship, what do you think of? When you think of fellowship, what comes to your mind? Just write those down. It'll be a very good process just to get you thinking more and more about the biblical purposes and how they can be best reflected in your youth ministry, and how you can take your passion for the one that God's given you to get most excited about.